In this video, we're going to look at the American Revolution from kind of a bird's eye perspective. I'm going to give you an overview of British and American strengths and weaknesses. We'll talk a little bit about why America wins the Revolutionary War and consider the costs of the war. Towards the end, we'll look at battles to remember and consider the outcomes of the Treaty of Paris. Let's start with the strengths of both Britain and America. In terms of the British, they have a number of strengths. The first thing is that they just have more people. Their population is around about 7.5 million people, whereas the colonists are only at about 2.5 million. The British have the best navy in the world. They're one of the most powerful countries in the world at the time. And even though they're in debt, they still have money available to push into this conflict. Through the course of the Revolutionary War, they're going to gain about 20,000 slaves with the promise for freedom, whereas the colonies are only going to get about 5,000 slaves to commit to fight for them. Many of the Native American tribes will join with British forces, at least for a time. They are worried and remember the land-hungry colonists, and so it's in many of their best interests early on to fight against the colonists. The British have a huge army. They supply about 50,000 troops in addition to the 30,000 Hessians, or those German foreign mercenaries that are hired. And then there are around about 20,000 colonial loyalists that fight for the cause. They have access to about 50,000, but they alienate a big portion of the loyalists that are there in the colonies. We'll talk about that more here in a second. Now, the American strengths are also numerous. They have extraordinary military and diplomatic leadership through people like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. And this is something that the British don't necessarily have. They get French aid almost immediately. It starts with financial aid and eventually will develop into military aid. They are also a little more flexible when it comes to fighting. Their defensive tactics are superior. They adopt the guerrilla warfare style of fighting. So when the Indians during the French and Indian War ambush the British troops from the forest and don't form proper lines and fight in a European style, the colonists kind of do the same thing. They take that example. The other thing that George Washington does is he has a strategy of never directly facing off with the British Army. And this works particularly well because it gives the colonists a chance to avoid a one-time knockout in battle because, Washington's aware that these forces that the British have are far superior in number to what the colonists have. George Washington never has more than 20,000 troops at his disposal at any given time. Agriculturally, the colonies are self-sustaining. They can ensure that they've got the resources they need. They are not dependent on anybody else. Many of their marksmen are pretty competent and are at times better than the redcoats at hitting the shots that they need to hit. And lastly, the colonists have this moral advantage. They're fervently fighting for a belief in a cause, and that's what unites them and keeps them going, whereas the British don't necessarily have that. Let's take a moment to consider the weaknesses of each side. In terms of the British, they have a huge distance to deal with between the colonies and England. They've got an entire ocean, and communication is really tough. The size of the colonies is a real problem for them. There's no way for the British to occupy all the colonies at once. They occupy most of the large cities throughout the war, but that doesn't really do them any good. Their generals are often poor leaders. And then, of course, the French support of the colonies is a big downside for the British as well. Let's consider the American weaknesses for a moment, and they have several. Especially early on, they are not well organized. Even though they're united behind a belief in a cause, they still have kind of a lack of unity when it comes down to doing things. The colonies, the individual colonies, don't always work together, and they often do their own thing. They kind of do what they want to because that's what they've previously done. The Continental Congress is very weak, and for most of the war, they function without a constitution, which makes them weaker. Finances are a real problem for the Americans. They print paper money off to the point of it being worthless. They have trouble paying the troops, and many soldiers desert because they're not getting paid and they have to figure out how to support their families. And our numbers are already decreasing and low, so this is a real problem for them. Throughout much of the war, they have inadequate military supplies. It becomes so bad that in 1779 and 1780, the Continental Army is confiscating basic necessities such as food and clothing to survive because the Continental Congress and the colonies are not providing those things. Because they lack supplies and they're not getting paid and all these organizational problems, the morale in the Continental Army is a continuous struggle. It's a continuous problem. And we see throughout the war that even though the colonists are passionate early on, there's not a huge percentage of Americans that remain committed to the cause. And so this becomes a real struggle too. Let's talk about how and why does America even win? You've got these underdogs going against the most powerful country in the world with the best Navy. How is it even possible that they win the American Revolution? Well, as mentioned previously, the geography and size of the colonies makes it really hard for the British to win. There's no major capital that they can take and win and say it's over. And with Washington kind of avoiding direct warfare, there's no way to have a knockout blow to win the war that way either. The British, because of their poor leadership, anger many of the loyalists that were originally on their side. There are about 50,000 loyalists in the colonies. And the British either assume that they don't have they don't have strong fighting ability, or they don't trust them. And so they only get about 20,000 of those people to fight on their side. As I mentioned earlier, Washington's policy of avoiding direct fights with the British Army and guerrilla warfare really helped the colonies win the war. And of course, the international support the colonies receive from countries like France, Spain, and the Netherlands is fundamental to winning the war. So let's talk a little bit about the costs. Anytime you have war, you're going to have casualties, you're going to have deaths. There's a human cost. For the colonists, we lose around about 4,435 people in battle. You're looking about 10,000 people who die of disease, and about 8,500 colonists die in British prisons as prisoners of war. In South Carolina and Georgia, they're going to lose about a quarter of their slaves who escape to fight for the British or just escape to freedom. And then we have a number of social and political costs or changes that occur. In the North especially, we see either outright abolition of slavery or gradual emancipation. They've just fought this war under the guise that all men are created equal. And for the North, even though it doesn't change some of the racial perspectives, it does change their stance on slavery. We also see state legislatures go in and start to change their constitutions. We have insurances of religious freedom in many of them. You see an increase in the size and power of the legislatures because we really want to protect against that monarchy or that single leader that can get out of control. And we see changes in taxation where they become more progressive with how they're taxing their constituents. There are a few battles to remember before we get to the Treaty of Paris. Of course, we know the first battles well before the Declaration of Independence is instituted. We've got Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, all in Massachusetts, outside of Boston in 1775. The Battle of Saratoga, which occurs in 1777, is critical. It's an American win that ultimately convinces France to provide military support to the colonies, and it helps turn the tide of the war, helps the colonists win. And then we've got the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. This is another American win. It's kind of a surprise win. The British surrender, and technically it's the last major battle of the war. We still have some skirmishes and things afterwards, but this is pretty much it. So the war is over in theory in 1781. The Treaty of Paris is not signed until 1783. There are a couple of components that you need to know about Treaty of Paris. The first thing is that the Treaty of Paris officially ends the war, and Britain formally recognizes Americans as an independent nation. The Americans get quite a bit of land out of this war. They have a western boundary of the Mississippi River. They have a northern boundary of the Great Lakes, and then their southern boundary is Spanish Florida. So it's pretty big territory that they've gotten. They have to agree to stop persecuting the Loyalists and restore any confiscated property that they took from Loyalists. They also agree to pay off those pre-war debts they had to Britain. And this will be kind of a problem because we're going to have financial issues in the first several years of the country's life. And then the last thing that's really important to note is that no one else really gets anything out of the American Revolution. They've got these allies, you've got Spanish, you've got the French and the Dutch, and it's really only the Americans that get any land. France will go bankrupt not long after this because they start fighting the French Revolution. Spanish, of course, get Florida back, but there's not much else that anyone gets out of the American Revolution. So now that America has won, they've got the real challenge of nation building, and that's where we'll pick up next.